Chapters 10 and 11 are over evolution, both the evidence for it and the process of it, or how it comes about. Before we go any further, I do want to make something clear. You do have to learn the material in these chapters. Even though you may disagree with it, you still need to learn it. The value in understanding the concepts behind evolution is the same as the value in learning about other religions. It'll allow you to carry on a good conversation with people who do believe in it. Many scientists and many Christians, for that matter, do wholeheartedly believe in evolution. You'll hear me use the term believe quite often in regards to evolution or creationism. The reason for this is that both require faith, and both are somewhat outside the realm of science. Science involves our observations. Since no one was around at the beginning of the earth, well, no human anyway, we don't have any empirical data from that time. Instead, we hypothesize about what might have happened and what the environment was like. We use the data we know today to extrapolate backwards in time, and that can be a dangerous thing. Anyone that's watched Mythbusters knows that small scale doesn't always equal large scale. Extrapolation be, and quite often is, incorrect. The other reason I use the word believe is because evolution is, quite frankly, the equivalent to religion to most atheists. They can become quite rabid when they feel it's being challenged in any way. Their typical response historically has been to flat out ignore any possible evidence against evolution and then criticize those who do try to investigate alternative theories as ignorant and fanatical. For this reason, if you're ever going to get into a discussion with a diehard Darwinian, you do need to know your stuff, and that's what I'm going to try to teach you through these chapters. Another concept we've already discussed this semester is bias. As you read through the chapters in the textbook, you'll notice that the authors are quite biased towards evolution and against any alternative theories. They take the evidence and interpret it in the light of the fact that evolution is and must be true, rather than taking the evidence and interpreting objectively. Many of their arguments for evolution can just as easily be used for special creation or intelligent design, depending on how you interpret the evidence. Much of the data that evolutionists cite as evidence can be explained by the flood as recorded in the scriptures, and you'll come across that as you research kind of the evidence for intelligent design and creation and all that. Now, just because they're biased doesn't mean you should ignore what they say. They have some very valid points. However, it does mean that you shouldn't take what they say necessarily at face value. The same thing could be said for me. I am quite openly biased towards special creation, as presented in the scriptures. Your textbook authors would say that I'm anti-evolution, which I think is another good example of how they consider evolution as a religion, even though they may not admit it to it themselves. But that does mean that you shouldn't take what I say at face value either. You should consider both sides to this debate and realize that we are both biased. It is impossible to escape bias, but that's okay. Remember, it's there as you interpret the evidence and form your own conclusions. Now, this brings us to a very important point. You will be responsible for learning both sides of this debate. That is, the evidence for evolution and the evidence against evolution that is also typically for special creation or intelligent design. Your textbook will present the evidence for evolution, and I will present the alternative evidence in your study guide, website links, videos, and discussion board links you'll see throughout this session in Blackboard. I've summarized a lot of the important info for both sides at the chart at the end of your Chapter 10 study guide, as well as giving you a few key points to remember as you are studying the material. Now, this is very important to me. I want you to know what you believe and have evidence to back it up. I also want you to sound educated and intelligent if you ever do get into a debate or a discussion with somebody who disagrees with you. Now, with that said, let's go over a few key concepts that you need to understand about evolution. So what we're talking about in these two chapters is Darwinian evolution. This is the traditional evolution. It was originally postulated by Charles Darwin, and there have been some changes to this, some modifications over time as scientists have kind of realized that there are some problems with his original theories. But for our purposes, we're going to be talking about traditional Darwinian evolution, and that is best summed up with the phrase common descent with modification. What that means, the common descent means that Darwin believed that there was one common ancestor for all life. And so that includes plants, that includes animals, anything that's alive. There was one common ancestor, and over time, millions and millions of years, billions of years, that ancestor, as it reproduced and had more and more offspring, and then those offspring had offspring, and then the offspring of the offspring had offspring, and just kind of down through the years, gradual changes occurred to give us all the different forms of life that we see today. So there's a common ancestor that in the genetics of the common ancestor, as it was passed down from generation to generation, more and more changes occurred until we had all the diversity of life that we see today. So that's kind of the modification part, is what's involved as the generations pass and the mutations and the changes from each generation to the next. So Darwinian evolution, common descent with modification. Now, the biggest problem with this is actually the origin of life. Darwin never really could explain where life originally came from, where that common ancestor, that first ancestor, came from. And this is something that no one has adequately explained to this day. No evolutionist has ever come up with a good theory. There were some experiments that were done in labs trying to replicate early Earth conditions and combining chemicals and trying to get amino acids or proteins to form. But those experiments have long since been proven to not really be valid because they didn't replicate the original Earth conditions as we understand today. So we do not have any sort of explanation for where life came from with Darwinian evolution so far. Some of the theories that have been postulated is actually that aliens came and deposited life on Earth, which still doesn't get us to the original life because we don't know where the aliens came from. So origin of life is kind of a common problem with Darwinian evolution. Kind of a point that you'll see as you watch the videos is the fact that if we take a cell, complete cell, and we put it into a saline solution and then poke a hole in the cell and let everything leak out, no matter how long we give that solution, and that's a good solution, that's kind of what your blood is like, a saline solution, the cell will not reform. So we don't understand how life begins. We can't even make life with the components of it that we have today, with all the science that we have today. The next concept is the idea of microevolution versus macroevolution, and this is important. Microevolution deals with changes within a species, whereas macroevolution is kind of the bigger thing. It's the changes from one species into a new species. Now, this is difficult to see because we don't all agree on what defines a species. Most scientists will agree that if it can reproduce within itself, within that group, that's at least one characteristic of a species. It should also look similar. So you'll come across some reports of macroevolution where a new species has developed or a new species has arisen, and some of that is a little bit of semantics. So if there's an example, it's a lizard that has moved to a new environment and now it looks different, it's a different color, it has a different tail length. Is that a new species or is that the same species that just looks a little bit different? And part of that has to do with, can it breed with the original species of where it came from originally? And so that's kind of part of the issue with this evolution, is defining what a species is so that we even know if we have new species. So microevolution, micro means little or mini, it's like a microscope or microscopic organism. Those are small changes within a species. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute, kind of how that happens with natural selection. But these are changes that you can observe. We've seen this kind of in the world around us, and I'll give some examples in just a minute. Macroevolution, where we have new species developing, that's very tricky. Some scientists would say that we have seen that, others would disagree. So macroevolution is really where there's the big debate over whether new species can arise as a result of microevolution. So this is the extrapolation, is that we see microevolution, so we extrapolate that macroevolution could also exist. Natural selection is based on several principles or several observations and then inferences made from those observations. So the observations that kind of let Darwin come up with the idea of natural selection is that he noticed that individuals within a population vary. So a population is all the organisms of one species in a particular location at a particular time. And he would notice that there are differences, just like there are differences in your class. Like when you go to class, the students look different. So the individuals do have differences within that population. The second concept, or the second idea that he noticed, is that some of the variations among individuals get passed on to their offspring. So Darwin didn't really know about genes and DNA and that sort of thing when he was coming up with these theories, but he did notice that offspring inherit characteristics from their parents. The third concept, or the third idea, is that populations of organisms will produce more offspring than will survive. And this is kind of a sad fact of life, is that of all the baby elephants that are made in Africa, only a certain percentage are actually going to live to be adults. They're not all going to survive. And then his fourth thing that he noticed, or what he felt, the kind of the inference, was that survival and reproduction are not random. So what he felt like was occurring is that the individuals that were best suited to their environment would be the ones that are most likely to survive, and therefore most likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. Now, I use the term genes. He would have said variations because he didn't understand genes. But that's basically what we're saying. This is the idea of natural selection, is that the people or the individuals that are suited to their environment are the ones that are most likely to live. And if you survive, if you live, then you're most likely to mate and have offspring, and those offspring are more likely to survive as well. So the end result of this, Darwin believed, was that certain traits or characteristics that allowed an individual to survive and reproduce would gradually become more and more prevalent in a population over time. So if a longer trunk in an elephant allowed it to get more food, then it would be more likely to live and reproduce, and it would pass on those genes for that longer trunk to its offspring, who would also be more likely to have a longer trunk and survive and pass on those genes to the next generation. So he felt like certain traits or characteristics were selected for by the environment. Natural selection is what he termed that. The English peppered moth is a good example of natural selection. In the original English countryside, the white moth with brown speckles was kind of what you typically saw, the peppered moth, and did well with the tree trunks and was unlikely to get picked off and eaten by owls or other prey. Now, whenever the Industrial Revolution came through and there was a lot of smoke and smog, that actually coated the tree trunks so they turned dark, and the moths that had more white in them were more likely to get eaten as prey, and then the moths that had more dark in them were more likely to survive. So over a period of several generations, natural selection selected for darker and darker moths. Basically, the moths were almost completely black. Now, what's interesting is that this is kind of a cyclical thing, because once the area was cleaned up and the trees were back to their normal color and appearance, the selection actually went the other way and ended up selecting back towards the speckled moth again. So, and that's something we'll see with microevolution, is it doesn't really seem to be progressive. It seems to be cyclical based off of what the environment is currently like at the time. An example for this would be antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Bacteria are kind of developing resistance to the current antibiotics we use today, but the antibiotics that were used several generations ago, several decades ago, they are susceptible to. And the reason we don't use the old school antibiotics is because the antibiotics themselves are quite dangerous. They have a lot of side effects to them, kidney failure, things like that, allergic reactions, those sorts of things. And so we don't typically use those unless we have to. But there's this idea that if you take away an environmental pressure, if you take away a certain antibiotic, over a period of time, the organism will readjust to the new environment. And so with bacteria, that means you could actually use the older antibiotics against the bacteria and they would be susceptible to them. So this is very cyclical. We have not really seen a whole lot of examples of macroevolution where an organism has continued to progressively change into a new species. My prayer is that as you work through the material this week, your faith would grow and you become more confident in what you believe. So if you have any concerns or questions, please email me. If I don't know the answer, I can probably point you in the direction of someone who does, or give you some resources to look through to try to figure it out. I want this to be a week where your faith will grow and your confidence in the scriptures will grow. And so if there is any doubts that you have, anything that you come across that worries you, I am here to discuss that. So please email me if that occurs.